I've tried to talk about Vipassana the last couple of times, and I'm going to continue with that today. The Burmese are kind of known for developing this whole idea of Vipassana meditation. In modern times, I think my understanding is in the 1950s, there were some people who started to introduce the method of Mahasi Sayadaw, his particular type of Vipassana meditation in Sri Lanka. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's kind of how a lot of these Vipassana retreats for lay people began, kind of the whole model for lay people who could come and do these, Vipassana retreats someplace at a center, and they're kind of guided through a particular method. The particular teachings that I'm kind of drawing from last month and this month are from a different teacher, not Mahasi Sayadaw, but Mokok Sayadaw, who, if you were in Burma, he would be very well known. He's not so well known in America because there haven't been a lot of Westerners who studied in his method, and as far as I know, there's nobody who was trained as a teacher in his method. But this book has some interesting ideas, so I'm going to quote from a couple of things about what Vipassana meditation actually is. And I'll say, I think I said this last month, but you'll find different ideas about this, and there's not 100% agreement on some of this stuff if you really dig into it. So, if you read one book or hear one talk from somebody, they may say some things that kind of disagree with what I'm going to say. And I've kind of studied a lot of the different methods and the ways of looking at Vipassana. And I don't know that there's any one method that's better or, correct. But I think that a lot of them have different emphases. They focus on different things, or maybe approach it slightly differently. But it's an issue that, there isn't any place in the suttas where the Buddha actually says, I'm going to teach Vipassana meditation now. It's not in there. He teaches, mindfulness of breathing. There's some discussion of jhana. There are instructions like that, and he teaches the principles of Vipassana in the wisdom teachings. How to see things as they really are, particularly in relation to the three characteristics, anicca, dukkha, and anatta. But he doesn't in any place actually say, okay, this is how you do Vipassana meditation. And so the methods of Vipassana meditation that we're sort of familiar with, that you might have encountered, oftentimes have been created or formed by modern time teachers, oftentimes the Burmese. So anyway, the list of 5 basic principles that separate the emphasis on Vipassana from the emphasis on Samatha or calm. So when we sit to meditate, we might have different goals in mind. We might have more of an interest in tranquility that day, or on some days we might be more interested in insight and developing the wisdom. Generally, wisdom is sort of dependent on having a foundation of calm. So oftentimes, for example, if you were to go to a Vipassana retreat, they would spend a certain amount of time on doing a tranquility practice like metta meditation for a day or longer, and then they would, after they have kind of determined that everybody's had enough time to develop a basis of calm, then they might introduce the Vipassana ideas. The thought is that for the wisdom faculty of the mind to actually have any effect, there has to be a fair amount of clarity and calm already present. So it's very common to teach the Samatha practice, calm practice for a length of time before you switch to Vipassana. And to do that here in an hour is kind of difficult, but I did want to share some things and just at least open the door to this idea of Vipassana. And I think in this little list of 5 principles that separates tranquility, Samatha practice from Vipassana, insight practice, there are some interesting things to reflect on that I'll expand on, I think. And I did actually already recite this list last month, but it's important enough to, I think, revisit it. And it's a deep subject, and I don't think we can even do it justice, unless we spend a little bit more time with it. So these are the 5 principles, and I think probably some of you at least have heard these before in one form or another. So the principle number 1, Samatha leads to jhana, while Vipassana achieves wisdom. So tranquility practices tend to lead to deep levels of tranquility that in the suttas are described as jhana states. And the Abhidhamma also has its kind of description in the commentaries, like the Visuddhimagga have descriptions of the different jhana states, the different levels of tranquility. But the Vipassana ideal is to achieve wisdom. So there's even the idea that if your jhana is deep beyond a certain point, the mind stops functioning in a way that would even allow the practice for wisdom. So the idea is that if the calm is so deep and the mind is so quiet, there may not even be the ability left to practice wisdom. So that's one idea that's pretty prevalent. So then the next idea, and this is going to be one that I return to later because I think it's really, really important. Samatha fixes on concepts which do not really exist, while Vipassana observes the ultimate realities which really exist. So to look at that a little bit, let's say that we're doing mindfulness of breathing as we typically practice it. You're going to think probably, okay, I'm a person sitting, I have a body, and now I'm going to focus on my breath. Well, in that, there are a number of concepts, a number of ideas about things, like I have a body, there's a physical body here, and my breath functions within the body, etc., etc. So are those concepts really real? Do they reflect reality? Or are they just mental creations that serve us in a conventional sense, in a sense that's practical, but maybe not in line with the highest truth of how we experience things, which is what Vipassana tends to focus on. And the suttas talk about different frameworks for deconstructing our experience from the conceptual level to look at it more deeply in its component parts. And there would be the 5 aggregates, the Panchakanda, 5 aggregates, that basically are categories that sum up our experience of the body and the mind into 5 different parts. There's also the 6 senses and their fields. which include the 5 bodily senses that everyone's familiar with, and then in this context, the mind is looked at as a 6th sense that experiences its own type of objects. So where sight has visible objects, hearing has sounds, smell, taste, the body experiences physical sensations, the mind experiences mental objects, thoughts, and so on. So in the framework of the 6 senses and their fields, the mind is included as a 6th sense that experiences its own type of objects. So as far as these different frameworks to deconstruct our experience with, to kind of see in a deeper way than just the concepts of having a body or, physical reality as we usually see it conceptually. You have these 2 ideas. These are the most, probably in the suttas, the most common frameworks, the 5 aggregates, panchakanda, and the 6 senses and their fields. Salayatana, I believe, is the Pali term for that. Is that right? Thanks. Yeah. So the suttas kind of take it down to that level, which we might say is sort of a magnifying glass, but the Abhidhamma takes a microscope, and goes even deeper into it and breaks things down farther than the 5 khandhas or the 6 senses and their fields, to where you have isolated mind moments that appear in a succession so fast that it's like millions of times in the blink of an eye. Now, this is kind of interesting for anybody who's thought about this. There are a couple of different ways that people tend to conceive of how this might be. Now, this is taught as something that can actually be experienced, and there are people who actually have experienced this. But when somebody says, okay, isolated mind moments of consciousness arising and passing away millions of times in the blink of an eye, how does that, appear? Is it like a massive, the whole, let's say if we're talking about visual consciousness, of course there are different types of consciousness, but let's just say visual consciousness. Is it like the entire visual field blinking on and off as, millions of times in the blink of an eye? That's even impossible to imagine, really. But then there's another possibility, and I think this is actually more what we're talking about. I could have brought a few quotes from Vipassana teachers who describe it this way, and this is what makes sense to me. It's more like a computer screen, pixelated. For those of you that work with computers, you can kind of imagine this pixelated view. And then with each of those pixels, now one of the things that's important is that the Abhidhamma does teach that we can only experience one moment of these millions per blink of an eye at a time. So in this pixelated picture, it would be not to be accurate in terms of the Abhidhamma, even though there's a pixelated screen, we're experiencing each of those pixels independently at a very fast rate. So my vision has never been that refined, where I could see that. I think somebody who's highly advanced like the Buddha or would be able to see that. But But I think it's possible to have glimpses of kind of a pixelated thing like that, maybe without seeing, the isolated, the way that each of those is, each of those pixels is arising and passing away at this incredible rate of speed. Anyway, spending a little bit of time at this, but I think that's, and then what the Abhidhamma does further is look at each of those moments that arise and pass away, and it talks about the factors that make up each of those, the mental factors, the cetasika that make each of those chittas, the mind moments, the isolated moments of consciousness, of its own special character. So there are different mental factors that, that's a lot of technical information, but one of the things that I find really interesting in that picture and helpful is that if we're talking about conceptual reality as just being sort of this more superficial gross way that we conventionally experience, and this Abhidhamma picture as being more like our experience at its most fundamental level, how is that helpful? Well, on that level, each of those moments of consciousness has a particular story. Each of those particular moments of consciousness is there because of certain roots, certain past karmic actions. And those are classified in terms of kusala, akusala, and then morally neutral, which I think might be, I could be wrong on this, but I think it's kriya. Functional, merely functional. I may be missing one of the morally neutral ones, but the main thing that I'm concerned about in my own life is the wholesome, the kusala root, and the akusala, the unwholesome root. So, in terms of what matters in life, the bigger picture conceptual reality is not as important as this level of what the root is of our experience. Is it wholesome, unwholesome, or neutral? As an example, one of the areas of my life, this is more of an everyday example, but one of the areas of my life that I still experience anger is when I'm driving my car. And I guess it's because, I'm in the car by myself, there's nobody there to judge me, and especially if I'm late to get someplace, I've got a goal, I have a storyline that I'm living. And I'm an actor in this story, there's a goal, and if that goal is frustrated, let's say there's a traffic jam, or a car accident, a traffic stop or something, or somebody's driving really slow in front of me, and I'm impatient, I want to, fulfill, especially if there are people waiting for me or something, I have obligations, I'm likely to feel anger. Well, that's all a story, that's all in conceptual reality, but that's not the real thing. The real thing is on the level of these moments of consciousness that are arising and passing away, and each of those has a particular type of root, wholesome or unwholesome. So anger, dosa, aversion, is one of the main unwholesome roots, one of the main three unwholesome roots. There's lobha, greed, dosa, aversion or hatred, and moha, delusion. Then this is a practical consideration. People can be happy or at least peaceful in all kinds of situations. they can have pain in their body. We've all read the story of the Buddha who was 80 years old and had all of these pains in his body, but at some point he was free. He was free mentally from all that. People can be poor and be happy, and people can be rich and be unhappy. We know that. I think anybody who's familiar with American culture and the stories that motivate a lot of us in America, they know that we can be unhappy in all kinds of situations where somebody else would be perfectly happy. But what's the determining factor in that? What makes the difference? And I would argue, and in my own practice, this is what I try to focus on, is the presence or absence of greed, hatred, and delusion in my motivation. So back in my car, if I'm experiencing anger because of this story that I'm living, I need to focus on that, because if I cultivate and encourage that anger, that's going to create an unhappy future for me at some point. Even if I'm living in a perfectly abundant material situation, I'm still going to be unhappy. So it's greed, hatred, and delusion. And greed, hatred, and delusion, to me, is the real story. It's the real story there. It's not whether I complete the conceptual game in an optimum way of getting to wherever I'm driving on time, fulfilling my obligations. The most important thing is the greed, hatred, and delusion in that moment. That's the real story. So anyway, I realized I said I was going to talk about these 5 principles, and I'm only on number 2. But anyway, I've kind of given you sort of the scope of how our conventional reality is deconstructed in a Buddhist way. We kind of start with the sutta level, where you're talking about the 5 aggregates and the 6 senses and their fields, etc. And then you get to the Abhidhamma level, which is kind of this more breaking consciousness down to its most basic function. Millions of mind moments arising and passing away in the blink of an eye. But the practical thing is that each of those has a storyline that's based on, being conditioned by greed, hatred, or delusion, or something neutral, a functional, basic functional intention that started at some point. I don't know if that's at all helpful. But anyway, okay, so that's the main deep part of what I would say Vipassana is really about, in terms of shifting our viewpoint, the wisdom that it's looking at. Why would anybody want to do that? I think I've kind of explained that, because happiness is based on the presence or absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. And the more that we get caught up in our stories that are based on concepts, the less we are in touch with that reality. Okay, so I think I've talked about that enough. I'll get through these other defining principles of Vipassana practice, contrasting with Samatha, tranquility practice. The third is Samatha focuses on a single object, while Vipassana observes the more distinct one. So, and I'll read the following one, which kind of goes along with that. Samatha, tranquility, brings back the wandering mind to the original object, while Vipassana watches the observing of the more distinct one. Now I have to kind of read that again, because there's a subtlety there. Samatha brings back the wandering mind to the original object. And I think we kind of understand that. Like, typically when we're doing a tranquility type practice, if it's the breath, when we notice that the mind's wandering from the breath, we bring it back to the breath. Or if we're doing metta practice, we might bring the mind back to the contemplation of metta. when we notice it wandering. But here it says, Vipassana watches the observing of the more distinct one. So it doesn't try to bring the mind back to the original object, the primary object. It watches the observing. It watches what the mind is actually doing as it experiences whatever the object is, whatever the more distinct object is, and we're not like picking and choosing among the objects. It's just whatever the mind most distinctly is experiencing. It watches how the mind is observing that. So is there a response of grasping, wanting the object to last longer, or is there an experience of pushing it away and hoping that that object ceases, not enjoying that object, for example? So watches the character of the mind that is experiencing, that is observing the more distinct one. I hope that's not too complicated. And then the final thing, which I think probably most of you have heard, Samatha calms down the defilements. For example, in talking about jhana, we know that the hindrances can be calmed and stilled temporarily, but the defilements themselves aren't eradicated through tranquility practice. Vipassana wisdom actually eradicates the defilements permanently, or has the potential to do that. Okay, so I'll just read those 5 principles quickly again without any commentary. Samatha leads to jhana, while Vipassana achieves wisdom, number 1. Number 2, Samatha fixes on concepts which do not really exist, while Vipassana observes the ultimate realities which really exist. Number 3, Samatha focuses on a single object, while Vipassana observes the more distinct one. Number 4, Samatha brings back the wandering mind to the original object, while Vipassana watches the observing of the more distinct one. And lastly, number 5, Samatha calms down the defilements, while Vipassana eradicates them. Okay, so as I said, that's one tradition's version of this on how to differentiate tranquility, Samatha practice from Vipassana practices. As I said, it may not be the only one, or necessarily more correct than something that you've heard or will hear. It's just one approach. It's one that I kind of like, although I don't necessarily deny the truth or the validity of others. So we have just under a half hour that we can actually meditate, and I think what I'll do is just start with something to kind of relax us. Kind of becoming aware of the body and the breath. And then toward the end, or at least in the second half, we have just under a half hour, I'll just bring up a couple of thoughts that might direct us toward a more Vipassana type orientation for the meditation, more insight-based meditation. Okay, we've got a couple more people here. My fellows. Okay, thanks for listening to that. I hope that wasn't too confusing or irritating. And so we'll just start to meditate now. This is the good stuff.